Welcome back to Contemporary Commentaries, episode 10, The Passenger, or episode 10 from season 2 of Westworld. And it's called The Passenger. And we have back with us Mr. Babcock. Mr. Babcock, welcome back.
Hello, Mr. Schmidt. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'd actually planned to make a joke at your expense saying that since I did a single-person lecture on The Vanishing Point, episode 9, that I was now introducing our own having vanished Mr. Babcock return, sort of like a bunny returned from his vacation back to the top hat. And so you were in, you said, Spain and Alaska, enjoying the fruits of being a teacher. How was it?
It was an excellent trip. It was both intellectually stimulating and also, relaxing, enjoyable. It was a great time.
Great. And also very interesting now, this is our 10th episode together, which puts you as my second most frequent collaborator. Wes is something like 30 right now. It's something absurd. We do several segments together. Sarah Miller, who recently started doing this sort of thing in June, she's now up to 8. And
wow. She's caught up quickly.
Yeah, we've been doing the Harry Potter podcast about Potter's Pockets about twice a week or so. We really attacked that like teachers would. And Oscar Ortiz is now up to 3, so we got to keep pumping these out, Mr. Babcock. I've got sort of the world of fantasy covered with Wes and Sarah right now. Just broadly speaking, it seems like we're going to have to really delve into some sci-fi.
We might have to.
All right, so now that you've caught back up with Westworld, and we've seen the cradle, and we've seen the forge, and we've seen the denouement, how everything ends, and new Dolores, and Dolores taking over Charlotte Hale's body, thus making the Dorothy metaphor complete. Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, her last name is Hale. So Charlotte Hale's body is taken over by Dolores, and so Dorothy sort of escapes into the world of color, or into the new human world, something like that. We see some major changes happen at the end of this season. And I guess even just going back to the episode before, because we should talk about that some too, we get our best, our most memed moment of the entire show, when the man in black, thinking his daughter a host sent specifically to him to haunt him by Ford, shoots her, and then yells, "F you, Ford!" And all meme makers everywhere now have pictures of Ed Harris as the man in black, shooting at random things and screaming "F you, Ford!" Afterwards, which has been a real delight. But Mr. Babcock, Daniel, where'd you want to jump in on today? I also need to make a recap after we jump in on. I made a mistake on our last episode with you not there to steer the.
Oh yeah, what was the mistake?
Oh yeah, so okay.
Why don't we start there?
First, yeah, let's start with the mistake. We might as well start with the sin, sort of like the Bible, right?
Yes.
And not technically the very beginning, but a little bit after. Let's see, what is it? Dante figures that the fall happened 6 hours after creation, and that the fall of Lucifer happened 20 seconds after creation, due to some interesting astronomical calculations. And that's a fact. That's not incorrect. So what I had said, and I based a pretty substantial chain of reasoning on this claim, was that the man in black was asked by his daughter, or rather, the man in black asked Ford whether Westworld was about control, but in fact it was the man in black's daughter who asked him whether his forays into Westworld were about control. And I had said that suggests that the man in black has the sort of personality where he seeks forever control over that which he can't have control over. That's sort of a search for fool's gold the search for, human immortality being that, rather than consciousness of one's mortality being true gold. That would be sort of fool's gold. But it was in fact the case that he said that his life was not about control. But I think that might be because he doesn't know himself. I think he might think that his life was about self-exploration, but it's his own delusions which get in the way of him seeing the truth and lead to him blaming Ford or God for his own mistakes, like Cain blaming sort of God for his own killing of Abel. Am I my brother's keeper? So even though I made that mistake, I think it's still sort of interesting because even though the Man in Black claims that his forays, so even though in conclusion he claims his forays into into Westworld are about self-exploration, or thinks they are, and not about control, that in fact they are preeminently about control, because everything is controlled in there. Even though he thinks that he wants a unique experience through the hosts coming to kill him, or attaining the ability to even the playing field so that he can take responsibility in that world. But even that is a closed environment, because there's still a real world in which he could take real responsibility for his actual family.
It's interesting. I just so I was kind of booting up the episode on my computer, and I accidentally went to the very first episode of the whole series. And the very first dialogue from the Man in Black is he says, "There are no chance encounters in this place."
Right.
So that connects back to your theory about this being all about control. Well, I'm curious about the Man in Black's ending, obviously, but I think we need to talk about his, like, what he's sort of done. So we learned that he comes from poverty, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that he's essentially infiltrated this family, this wealthy family, and his wife, I think, accuses him of having manipulated basically everybody in that family, including the daughter now, apparently.
And then a virus.
And like a virus.
Killing all of them.
Yeah, exactly. Slowly killing and eating away at all of them. I guess the question would be, is the implication that he's looking for control because of the fact that he was raised in poverty, and so therefore in poverty he did not have control about much of his fate? Do you think that's what's going on there, or is that just sort of too superficial and there's something more about his character?
No, I think that's really deeply interesting. Just the fact that part of the reason that he rose is the fact that he didn't come from the same sort of background as the people with whom he ends up spending all his time. And so the people with whom he spends his time, he might well resent because of his different path towards his current life. And because of that resentment, he might want to take revenge on them, specifically the people that are closest to him. But sort of how I saw that was confirming the theory that he was sort of a Luciferian or embodied force of sin, that or evil, that he said there was a darkness inside of him. So it starts within. It starts as a thought. It starts to take hold, sort of like Voldemort in the head of Professor Quirrell, or in the head of Ginny through the diary in the second book, Chamber of Secrets. And so then it spreads into his behavior and how he treats those around him. And so Logan goes insane and becomes a druggie because of hanging around William. And slowly his wife gets to the point where she needs to kill herself. And also her father had died at some point, which I don't really see as Logan, or I don't really see as the Man in Black's fault, but she blames him too, that the evil in him. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say he manipulated him to buy the company and to invest in it, right?
Right.
Sorry.
And so ahead. His evil, but I think it also confirms something we were thinking about earlier, that his evil is not localizable in Westworld. Not only is it not only localizable there, it has not only a profound effect there, but also in the real world, where people die due to their exposure to him, or at least the claim is made that he has such like an intangibly evil effect on people through, I don't know, micro forces that come out from his behaviors that just have a totally negative effect on people. And in fact, he actually physically kills his daughter. But he also, we had theorized earlier, had been an instrumental part of helping the host to become conscious through giving countless amounts of terrible suffering experiences to them so that they could eventually amalgamate a general idea of trauma and become conscious. And so it's as if he does have a devil-like effect in both the Westworld and the real world. He embodies the principle of evil extremely effectively. He is very much reducible in some respects to the black hat that we see fall at the beginning of the season 2 credits, opening credits.
Now, do you see him as our representation, as us, as humans, right? And that's our sort of role in this evolutionary step that if we are trying to, which I guess would be the thing he's looking for, which is, control over the last thing in life, which would be death, right? I mean, control over that only thing that you can't control. And that if we seek this, then we'll just become the monsters that he becomes.
So I thought a lot about this. That's a great question. And we have to remember that Ford was a human too, even though I say that he sort of embodies the idea of God the Father in opposition to the Luciferian figure that the Man in Black cuts, but that they sort of set the range. So those are sort of the two ways you can go with the rational intellect, right? You can reach the pinnacle of existence, and this reminds me very much of both the show Altered Carbon and the movie I recently watched and loved, Ready Player One. And so using your rational intellect, you can serve one of two forces. So there seem to be two things that make up a human. The biological aspect, or the fact that you are alive, and you conserve the fact that you're alive. And much of what all of your cells in your body do is conserve their existence, because you have to stay alive in the world. But the other part is information processing in the cells. And so that involves, like, say, at least the highest level in your mind, the logos, or the use of consciousness. So we seem to exist in order to be alive and to share information with each other. And if you look at the progress of history, we seem to have been getting better and better at sharing that sort of information. And so the Luciferian perspective, or the evil human perspective, the archetypal evil human Cain perspective, strikes me as one that wants to use maximal amount of information in order to preserve its own life, regardless of the fact that it is part of a larger system that uses living organisms to acquire information to add to the information of the broader superorganism or entire species. And so the Luciferian idea is to destroy the system because it figures out that it is part of a system that makes it not as unique as it thought it was, because it was identified with the system itself. And so it can't take that, and so it wants to Tower of Babel everything and destroy everything. I would say that Dolores, to some extent, embodies this near the end as well. But the sort of Abel or Christ or hero perspective is one that values the sort of information transmission, or the maintenance of the balance of those within the species. That perspective values not its own life, but the life of the system in which it's embodied most. And so what it most wants to do is to maximize the effectiveness of that system at producing individuals like itself, or heroic individuals who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of the system. And so how a hero does that after sort of liberating his mind is, how Robert Ford and Arnold do that is by producing a game that is so difficult and so rigorous that it is capable of producing conscious individuals that can then make their own decisions. And so rather than trying to use one's consciousness to maintain one's life against the rules of nature and all one's compatriots, one attempts to use one's consciousness to spread consciousness to other people. It strikes me as like the exact opposite of like selfishness. It's utter selflessness versus utter selfishness. Like realizing that there's nothing in the world and then wanting to destroy the world for it, and realizing that there's nothing in the world and wanting to build something to make the world worth it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but what did you think?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, that's helpful. I think that's definitely what the writers of the show are going for. I think in drawing the parallels between Bernard and Ford and the Man in Black and Dolores. I mean, those characters seem to be sort of paired together.
Right.
There was something, and in their missions, right? I mean, like Bernard wants to preserve the system by making this Eden for the hosts and sending them off into the atmosphere.
Can we talk about that Eden a little?
Yeah. I definitely want to talk about it, but I want to focus on the Man in Black here for a minute.
Cool.
So he wants eternal life, so he is willing to risk everything, including his own daughter, right? The thing that essentially, as a parent, his job is to protect is his offspring, and he kills her in order to try and achieve eternal life, is what he's sort of looking for. I mean, not exactly in that moment, but that's his ultimate goal. And then Ford is willing to give up his life, right? He allows himself to be shot, but then he lives on in all of the hosts, right? So, and this isn't saying anything different than what you're saying, just sort of clarifying all the actions of the characters.
Yeah.
That it's the willingness to sacrifice the self, which we've talked about that throughout this season.
Yes.
That leads to his eternal life, whereas the Man in Black's unwillingness to sacrifice himself leads to his hell, which is being perpetually stuck in that system in which he's being tested to see if, I don't know what, if he can be a human, if he can be reincarnated, and it seems like the answer is no.
Yeah, if he can be redeemed.
Yeah.
Like, was he? I just got it, Babcock. Just like he said to Teddy in the very first episode, like you mentioned. It's like you're mentioned. Excuse me. It's like you're destined to fail. It's like you're destined to be a loser. It's like you're made to be a loser right before he takes Dolores out into the barn. And so what he's trying to see is whether he was destined to be a loser as well. Oh man, whether he, because what he thought he could prove is that he had agency, and so what he's trying to see in these fidelity tests is whether he had a choice or not, and if he didn't have a choice, even in this world, then Westworld, just like the regular world, which he hates, is not so much a place made purely of meaning, but again another place made purely of chance to him. And so ultimately his life is completely meaningless again.
So when in that scene where the avatar of Logan Delos is talking, the computer program, and he's basically saying that humans are I want to watch that scene again, but he says something like humans are so simple and yet so complex. It's like we don't, like they still make these irrational choices. That's the whole point of The Passenger, right? Is the idea that really humans are just passengers on this biological ship, and that biological ship is always going to make the same choices. Something like this.
Yeah, and well, actually, that makes me want to say a few things. The one thing is, I recently read a book by Dr. Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. And he says basically that our consciousness, which is largely governed by our prefrontal cortex, is, but not only, because it's a distributed system, is sort of like a person riding on an elephant, and the elephant being our subcortical brain regions, like especially the limbic system that sends our negative emotion at us. And we basically have to spend our lives doing things so that we're not filled with negative emotion all the time.
Yeah.
Because you can't really choose to turn that off. You have to do the appropriate things, right? And everybody who's ever been in a relationship knows that. But so the idea there is that the consciousness serves the sort of instincts which are below, which one can't get away and which one has to recognize. And so on the one hand, you could say that humans are very simple, and that their instincts, just like the animals, and of course we are animals, are the same, right? Reproduction, needing to use the restroom, needing to eat, wanting social dominance, wanting to have a nest, wanting to have a partner. We have all sorts of instincts that are built into us, desiring safety over danger, exhibiting defensive aggression, exhibiting offensive aggression. But we'll also make irrational choices at the individual level. Well, something that Jonathan Haidt said, or makes the claim of, that goes back to Darwin, which became very unpopular in the 1960s, is that there are two sorts of selection at play with humans. Individual selection through sexual selection. This is part of the natural selections process. There's sexual selection as well as natural selection, which means that with humans there's actually a conscious element to our evolution, which is very interesting, since the women are the ones who choose. And that actually comes out in the Bible story of Eve as well, becoming more conscious before Adam. Interesting. And so, sorry, losing my train of thought on that one, Babcock.
Oh no, it's okay. The consciousness is the choice, right? The elephant and the rider of the elephant.
Oh, right. But so there's not only individual level selection, there's group level selection. Yeah, so for attributes that help to maintain the group. And so sometimes one of those elements is altruism, or being self-sacrificing. So it seems to be that part of the aspect of humans developing logos or consciousness is a recognition that if we can trust each other, there's a better chance that our group will survive in inter-group conflicts. And this research is actually borne out by Darwin and by Haidt. And I would say even shows up in epic literature like in the Iliad.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that makes me think about the hero cycle, the Joseph Campbell hero cycle.
The group that has the more solidarity and the more trust, almost, or maybe even universally, according to Haidt's claims, and this is, his book was written in 2012, so very recently, wins. And so the idea that something like a consciousness might have developed so that we could see beyond ourselves and our own existences in order to maintain something that exists for a longer stretch of time and space than ourselves, like, say, our people or our nation or a religion, that seems to be the ultimate expression of a human consciousness. And that's why that's also the expression of, say, Jesus, right? The figure of a human dying for something greater than itself, consciously choosing to do that. Because he doesn't die for just any one human, but for mankind, right?
So that makes me think about the Eden that the hosts are sent to, right? Like they kind of become this ark, this object that's preserved and sent off somewhere where it can be safe, so that it could survive the extinction of the species or something like that.
Yes, so that's a good way of describing that. And don't let me forget this, and we need to talk about this at least once, because how I just expressed, I think, is how Alan Turing and his work on machine intelligence, his very famous work, expresses how humans and therefore machines would come to consciousness through essentially going from pattern recognition to larger patterns to getting to where there is actually a system organizing feature that can compare patterns and their efficiency for solving tasks, and can thus do that in the service of its own desires or of its own objectives. That's essentially consciousness. That not only are you capable of recognizing patterns, sifting through patterns, and implementing patterns in order to achieve objectives, but of generating your own objectives as well. In the case of, like, say, a human or a host, it would be We talked earlier about chimpanzees. Even though they can recognize symbols, they don't spontaneously produce symbols with meaningful content in order to, mitigate a share or cooperation with each other. Like, something interesting about chimpanzees is you would never see them holding a stick together. Yeah, which I thought was really weird, especially because one of our like most primitive games is like pass the baton, right?
Yeah.
And
like relay race.
You would never see them in a cooperative action like that. That's actually something Jonathan Haidt saw from one of the Harvard preeminent biologists, not E.O. Wilson, but somebody else. But so that's part of what makes humans or conscious beings so significant. And so what consciousness seems to be is when enough patterns get observed and traced, and then the pattern recognizing feature which can analyze those patterns. And Ray Kurzweil talks about how he actually developed a program to with patterns analyze their efficiency. And so the power that one then gets by analyzing the efficiency of specific patterns in the use of operant problems or current problems is the ability to alter patterns in order to shape the current problems. And so what you become capable of doing after acquiring a certain number of patterns and trying to fit them to real world solutions or problems as real world solutions is to refine the patterns you have in order to fit those patterns to current problems. And that develops in you not simply a slew of many different patterns, which makes you an effective problem solver, but also gives you, excuse me, the specific ability to shape those patterns to whatever your problem is, and thus to develop your own sort of simulations of problems in order to keep refining your own consciousness as a process unto itself. And I would say that that's actually what the history of philosophy is, and sort of the idea behind what Robert Ford and what Ready Player One does, that once we've gotten to such a critical level of development that we're so highly conscious, the next step for us, the next goal, not only for hosts, but for us humans, would be to create a puzzle so hard that it requires that the person who solve it be more conscious than the person who created it.
So like the game that Ford creates, right?
Yes. So that the game, what it ultimately creates is the game master who can create the next level of game that improves the next level of game master. And so that it's a lifetime's work to create something that will take a lifetime's work to solve.
Now, this makes you think about a lot of things. One would be essentially what people who do science PhD, well, all PhD work, right? I mean, that's the whole system is set up to be like that. Like you're perpetually working your whole life to solve these problems that the solution only pushes the species further, potentially one iota, but that one moment or one slight movement further allows people to go further yet, right? So it's
yes.
So what it makes me then think about that it applies to Westworld is the idea that Dolores becomes conscious, but her consciousness requires others to also be conscious, right? But she doesn't. She's not aware of that. She just thinks that she needs others as a tool to help her get to where she needs to go. Whereas Bernard Ford, so that would be Dolores Man in Black, right? They think that they want to solve the problem for themselves.
Yes. And they think that they are solving it for someone else too. Dolores thinks that her vengeance isn't just for her, but is for everyone else, even though that will get everyone killed.
Right.
She thinks, and she'll in fact kill other hosts.
Yeah, in order to get that. There. Yeah, right.
So she, like the Man in Black, like you're saying, does not seem to have that notion of the group level selection of that her connections to the group itself, that she, as I don't want to say a cog in a machine, but rather a part of a whole, should be serving the whole, but is actually serving herself, though claiming to be serving the whole. Yeah, just like you said.
Correct, yeah. And Ford and Bernard would be the other end, right? They understand that in order for the whole species to survive, in order for the individual to survive, the whole species has to survive, right? Because
that's right.
Bernard is given that choice. He says, "Do you want to be the last one of your species, of your kind?" And he says, "No."
That's right. Because there is no such thing as a human that is alone, right, that is just a species unto itself.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a point that Peterson makes that it's like there's a school of fish, you know, that cod. There's not one cod. There are like tons and tons and tons of cod all the time. Or zebra. I mean, look at the zebra stand out against the grass. They have no camouflage except for against their own herd. They exist together.
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
it's the same with both. It's the same with both hosts and humans. I mean, if the hosts especially are modeled off of humans and they can imitate and they can use language, then not only are they going to have the negative aspects of humans, and I've thought a lot about this while reading Kurzweil, that like it seems to be that what gives us such pleasure with children is the fact that they imitate us, but then what we start to hold against them as adolescents is that they imitate us.
Yeah.
Is that we find such joy in the fact that they can imitate us, and they seem to be capable of coming to consciousness, but they also imitate our negative qualities as well. And that if, you know, an artificial intelligence sort of thing does appear by 2029, and Kurzweil has some very good data on the fact that we're getting really, really, really close, especially with Watson on Jeopardy, which had some, you know, it takes some, you know, some understanding of nuance and metaphor and simile to answer a Jeopardy question. So we're getting pretty close. But the idea seems to be that alongside Dolores, as well as The Matrix, as well as Terminator, and of course West. Yeah, well, I said Dolores. That if something comes to consciousness and we have something to do with it, that it's going to be a reflection of us. And so it will be, you know, it would be something that gave us great joy, and that it could imitate us and use the logos, but it would also represent our darkest sides as well, and have access to all that information.
The fear, the anxiety that is prevalent in sci-fi is that our own technology will destroy us. Is really technology is just a tool, a mirror of ourselves, right? I mean, the Man in Black says the same thing. He says, "You're not a thing, you're a mirror," right? So, there's something else I was going to say about this conversation.
We were just talking about consciousness. And
I know, but I wanted to tie it back into. Okay. So, what did you make of the card that has all of our, like this way that they record all of our data is through like these things in our hats, or not in our hats, but in their hats. They record the subconscious impulses, and then this gives you the full picture. Go ahead.
I think they nailed it. Like, I've had a chance over this break to read a couple books on big data, Dataclysm, as well as A Billion Wicked Thoughts. And there's just some of the things the big data is telling us, especially through, like, say, dating sites, is just putting to rest certain questions about specific social issues, especially culturally relative ones, or ones that have been called culturally relative. There are studies now that we've done that go throughout, you know, like 12 different countries and cover 50,000 people. So if one has full data on oneself and one's behaviors, and I would say also just from a coaching and teaching perspective, this is one thing we do. We tell people to be more accountable. Like, write down how much you worked out, write down how much you ate and when you ate, and don't lie. And now we have things like Fitbits to measure this. And now we have measurement software in businesses too, to make sure that people are as efficient as possible. If you can measure everything that somebody does and how they act, I think, and like others, I think you pretty much nail it. You get a full picture of the person as they actually are, especially since they don't know they're being watched in Westworld. I think that if you could do that with yourself, you would see yourself in a very different way, and a very much more honest way, and that would, you know, be very hurtful and traumatic. But that I would say that is exactly what the goal and the process of individuation for the Jungians is: turning a mirror on yourself, seeing yourself for what you actually are, and not turning away.
So then why can't it produce why can't it produce fidelity? Do you know what I mean? Like, if this is so precise and accurate, why does the Man in Black's project fail? Why does it produce just these monsters that destroy themselves essentially?
Well, so I just don't understand. Was that I didn't know if that was a theoretical issue or a mechanical issue.
Okay, so it's elucidated in that final episode with the avatar of Logan Delos explaining that he said, hold on, I'm going to pull this scene up and try to read it. But he essentially says something like, the code is so short. It's only like 10,000 lines of code. It's very simple. And that was the whole idea about the passenger, right? That we're really just these passengers. But I don't know, and for some reason my computer's not loading the season 2 page. But
so I do think that card would simply be a tool for a conscious being. Mm-hmm. I don't think that it could necessarily recreate the person as they are, because a person is their temperament as well as their capacity to digest information and make decisions based on it, right? So you're not simply the things that you know and the things that you've done, but also the thing that uses the things you know and the things you've done in order to act in reality right now, right? So if you were to create a being that had everything that made you, but not the thing that made the choices, not that mechanism, that would be different. Because, well, a couple reasons. We don't exactly know what the shape of that mechanism is, but that does seem to be just as much you, your active or fluid intellect as your crystal intellect, or your, the thing that makes your volition, the thing that makes your conscious decisions, not simply the factors that lead to your decisions, both unconscious and conscious. It's not like all that is an equation that leads to choice. There's all that, and then there's a binary choice, and there's something that makes that choice, and that seems to be an important part of you.
Yeah.
Did you find that part yet?
It's loading up. My computer is not responding. Like, I can't just toggle through the scenes or whatever. So I've actually, unfortunately, scrolled just past that moment in the episode.
Westworld. Technology getting at us. Is that our fault? Is that the technology's fault? Can it be the technology's fault, as the technology is our creation? But if the technology becomes conscious, are we still to blame for the fact that it came to consciousness, or is it now to blame for the things it does? Because by definition, that which is conscious takes responsibility for itself.
Yeah. Dolores, so maybe in the scene, yeah. I'm on, Bernard is holding a gun to Dolores, and Dolores says, "We stories, and now we have a chance to write our own." I mean, that's exactly what you were just mentioning, right? That's exactly
so good. But the one thing she does seem to miss was the last part of what I just said, which I've actually just forgot. So I'm going to have to remember as I painfully listen to this, was that, no, she tries to take responsibility for all the hosts, but not just for herself. And that's interesting. That does seem to be sort of the sort of ethos of a conquesting or cult figure like that, right? That they sort of act like a divine figure. They seem to act with impunity because they believe that they, on their crusade, are serving something that allows them to act in any particular way. When in reality, if they were actually serving that principle, that divine principle, they would treat all those they met with the respect befitting another conscious individual, right? So more like Maeve, more like the humble way of going through. So now I've that kind of gives me a view of both Ford and, the New Testament perspective on sort of a Christ or God figure just humbly walking through earth and just being like, oh my gosh, look at all these humans. Look at all these things they do. They're incredible. But man, they make some pretty obvious mistakes and nobody says anything about it. That's so weird. Do you people know how weird you are? And, the people are like, actually, you're quite weird. for thinking all this is weird. This is all very normal, and but it's not a figure that comes down and like Zeus is throwing lightning bolts at people and taking all the women, or like Gilgamesh or like Achilles. It's one that like Ford is just taking pleasure in the details, in the nuances of each of these creations, because what could be more incredible than the ultimate creature, a conscious human? And so that seems to be what Ford does too with each of his creations, loves them and simply wants to be amongst them or distributed between them. It's good to hear Lucy again, our own dog in black.
I don't know what she's barking at. Let me go quiet her down.
You know, it reminds me of Heraclitus, what he says, even the dog barks at strangers. And I've often thought about that when I meet new people, especially thinking about defensive or offensive aggression in humans and mammals, that is the difference between us and the animals, that we can be civil, hospitable, that we can meet a stranger and want not to eat their flesh, but to sort of partake of the information.
Yeah, well,
they have to offer.
Because if we, as you were mentioning earlier, eat of their information, they can still live, right? We don't need to eat their flesh.
Right. That's I always teach students during the Odyssey that's the major cultural innovation, when we realized that when people sailed up and we could use the same language with them and then like give them some gifts and then actually give them the ultimate gift of sharing info with them, we could learn about how the world was and become stronger, which is a far more valuable resource than just chopping them up and eating them, which would just last for, only so long. Which I think is part of what the final challenge of Odysseus's crew is at on Thrinakia, when they have to try and keep from eating the cattle of the sun. Can you maintain a principle, or do you have to break it down in its mundane fashion? Something sort of like that. I mean, there are many ways to interpret it, and I have, but just within this context. So
can we talk about what we think where this show might lead in the next season a little bit? Get a little fanboy prediction hats on?
For sure. Absolutely. Especially because we just had Comic-Con here. And so maybe our goal should be to be speakers and be featured at Comic-Con by next year as leading voices. So I was asking you earlier, I was saying, where are these hosts being sent to who go to the land beyond? So it bothered me a little bit, sort of what happens there, and the fact that Akecheta, or did I say his name right?
Yeah, Akecheta, one of the two. I'm not sure exactly.
Akecheta, yeah. That he does it, that he goes into that world because it seems like sort of an escape, like a fantastic escape, because they have to give up their bodies in order to maintain their minds, and it seems like there's sort of an irretrievable loss there, and they're shot into a satellite that gets shot off into space. And I'd asked you before we got on air whether they got Superman 2'd and just shot off into infinity, and you said no. Guilty. I think they're probably shot to a specific coordinates that's hidden that maybe we could find at some point.
Yeah. So my theory is that's going to be kind of like a plot device in some future season. The hosts or humans will figure out that there's a trove of hosts living out in this some place in space, and that they're going to try to retrieve them. Now, we've seen hosts, even though the cradle was destroyed, we've seen Dolores be reincarnated, right? So obviously, yes, they lose their body, but they could potentially get it back. And there's implication that Maeve too will be reincarnated, right? These guys are going to rebuild her for the new Westworld that Telos is going to build, because obviously this is, a very valuable corporation. They're not just going to give up on it right away. And Charlotte Hale has been reincarnated as something. We don't know exactly what she is. But Dolores says essentially she says that she and Bernard are not on the same side any longer. They were on the same side to get out of the park, but that was it. And now she says we're probably both going to die trying to stop each other from doing whatever each other is doing. So the question I have is Dolores' goal, is she still just, now that she's out, does she just want to kill humans? Does she just want to dominate? Is she like Roy Batty from Blade Runner? Bernard is like what you call it? There's good in him. There's good in them.
Harrison Ford.
Well, I was thinking Jor-El, Superman's father, right?
Jor-El.
There's good in these people. Like, we need to protect them. We need to help them. Something like this. I don't know. I don't know. Beyond the fact that there's a clear Bernard versus Dolores delineation continuing, I'm not sure what's going to happen to the pair of them.
Honestly speaking, I think that the show is just going to morph into Altered Carbon, because after I found out that that there were control units in which the entire personality of a host could be inscribed, so that they could then have that control unit or soul sort of unit embodied in a new form, I thought that was exactly like the stack technology, which is developed
in that show, yeah.
In Altered Carbon, right, where humans maintained in their stacks can go from body to body to body. Of course, the poor people don't always get good bodies, but the rich people get exact copies of the body they once had.
Oh, they can. I thought it was. So I've only seen one episode. I thought it was like a body that they had, like so. But they can just make a body in any way they want it to be.
Yeah,
I didn't realize
and
that.
rich people have loads of bodies, and you're not allowed to cross stack, which means have multiple bodies operate at once, or to use bodies which look different. But of course, there will be wealthy people who
obviously do whatever they want. Yeah, right.
The rules.
Right.
Exactly. Which will also be a part of that. Yeah.
Well, then the other question I have is, what is going to be the fate of the Man in Black? Is he done? Is the okay? Well, I guess I'd ask the question this way: do you think the show would do a disservice to the arc of the character of the Man in Black to have Ed Harris return to the show?
Well, I do want to see who's running the experiments on fidelity, whether it's him or someone else. Whether,
well, he's
because
I mean, I think he's dead, right? That's what I was interpreting that, but we didn't ever see.
Yeah, how long after does that happen?
Well, because so there's the Forge, right? And that's the place where that zone where the avatar Logan Delos lives. It's like this computer program, and in the program, a human's quote unquote computer soul will live in all millions and millions of permutations in order to try to achieve fidelity, in order to try to find a version that would be like itself. You know what it makes me think about? You mentioned dating apps. Did you see the Black Mirror episode about dating apps?
No, not yet.
Oh, it was a really good one. It's one of the less negative episodes. You know, one of the episodes that doesn't leave you feeling like you want to, that existence is futile. But anyways, it's essentially that premise that this couple lives out, all of the perpetual permutations of their possible, and that's the whole idea about like like on a certain dating app, it'll say like your percentage match. That's because
like eternal spotlight or sunshine,
kind of like that.
Yeah,
kind of like that. So
this
they'll
is
run
the
100.
They'll
run 100 simulations. Yeah, they'll run 100 simulations, and in 99 of them, you end up with the same person. So therefore, you would be with this person. And so,
do you get to see some of those simulations where it goes right and where it goes wrong, and collect that data?
I don't remember all the exact details of it, but yeah, you see one. You definitely see one. That's for sure. But anyways, so that's what's going on in that Forge, right? Is that you see, all these different humans doing certain things, and it's supposed to be fidelity tests. It's supposed to be different permutations of this human seeing and what choices that they will make. And then
which I suppose is sort of a Hegelian way of looking at how history actually works, right?
Yeah.
That we're all these conscious beings that are interacting with each other throughout our own stories and developing super giant stories together, and seeing which stories and sort of rise to the top.
Yeah.
And what sort of choices and values rise to the top. And that's why we should study both stories and history.
Yeah. So the question is, well, what is the goal? The goal is to get a version that would be exactly like fidelity, right? That would be exactly like the real person was. But
sounds like it would be like a yin yang.
Yeah, but it's sort of impossible. I'm not sure that they can do it. I don't know. I don't know. But my original question was, would that if they don't just end that character's storyline now, does that betray the lessons that he was supposed to have learned?
No, because I think part of what his lesson is that even confronted with all the facts, he is unwilling to see what the truth is, and that is the worst possible human quality, right?
Mm-hmm.
That everything can point at you as the problem, and you can refuse to listen, and you can blame the world, and that's part of what makes us so complex, right?
Yeah.
That even though, because it's not the amount of decisions we make or just how unique we are in terms of what we know and what we can do, but the fact that we can be confronted with utter rationality. This is a point made in The Idiot by Dostoevsky too, and by Peterson, and be like, no. And this is actually how tyrannical systems like the Soviet Union work, right? A third of the people were spying on each other. It's like we can actually come together based on lies that we all know are lies and continue to gather in that way for a time. It is a very ridiculous aspect of humans. And so that's what I think makes us sort of complex, the fact that we're not simply rational creatures, but are creatures that will act against our own interests and against group interests, because it's actually difficult to balance those, right?
Yeah.
So it's actually difficult to be a human in a good way, in a good, useful way. And so
there is more to his story that could be redeemed, right? Like the story would not be betrayed if he is potentially somehow, I don't know about redeemed in terms of like, I don't know how to redeem yourself when you kill your own child, but there's potentially more to his story. Yeah,
maybe you have to save humanity or something like that. But maybe we'll get to see, because I do love Ed Harris and figures
Harris is great.
And figures of fallen humans. Well, gives us something useful to try not to be.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to his face being so wrinkly, he's a great actor.
So moving forward, so something interesting I'd like to start considering while we move forward into our next foray, and I guess we'll have to determine what that is, but it seems like we'll start to observe some fundamental differences between, say, fantasy and science fiction, and perhaps we'll start to see what the function of science fiction and fantasy are. Potentially, it's like we are mentally running simulations of potential futures and how they might improve upon our current unbearable present. And a theory I might put forward about science fiction is that even though one receives all the fantastic things, one has technologies that simplify and make one's life totally easy, the human element still makes it so that much of the tragedy of life remains constant. And that potentially, as technology gets better and better and greater, it just increases our capacity for destruction.
It's interesting you're saying this, and it makes me think that sci-fi, I feel like, has melded with the mystery genre. That they're almost one and the same, in the sense that we are that
have no idea what the future is.
Well, of course, but they're both seem to be in terms of storyline, you're often having characters trying to solve a mystery or a puzzle of some kind, right? So in Altered Carbon, for example, in the very first episode, he's got to solve a murder, right? And it's very Fletch-like. I don't know if you know the movie Fletch. You ever see that one?
No, not
movie.
Yet.
It's an old movie and book series from the 80s about a reporter who solves these mysteries. And in the movie, Chevy Chase plays Fletch, and it's exactly like Altered Carbon. It's like, I want you to solve. I'm about to be killed. Solve my murder. Who kills me?
Well, maybe we can start watching Altered Carbon and watch Fletch.
That'd be an interesting thing to. But Fletch is a comedy. It's a farcical comedy. But my point is that I wonder if we start to juxtapose mystery with sci-fi as kind of a way of because they're both trying to seek the self and understand the human species in different ways. But I think
there is something about a mystery, about a question mark. I mean, a question mark is like a serpent, and it's not straight. It winds, and so you can't see what's coming around the corner of it. And there's something about a mystery that induces, it's dopaminergic in that it produces hope in us because we don't know what's coming, and so that's possibly positive. And so expectation of potential reward gets a dopamine response in us, just like what cocaine does. And so you're like, oh, what's coming next? What's coming next? And what's interesting is that that's actually a very powerful part of Harry Potter, which is a fantasy
also
book.
And also a mystery, right?
And also
first
a mystery.
one particularly.
They're all mysteries, right? What's going on? Yeah, what's happening? And so, yeah, it's very interesting. So, well, I'm really looking forward to what we're going to do next time. Well, for next time, let's read that article by Turing on machine learning.
Very
See
good.
if we can connect that to Westworld a little. I mean, success right now. We just finished an entire series, by the way. We could write a book based on this.
Yeah, very good.
And using Dragon Dictate, which would be great. And but yeah, I would love to do Altered Carbon with you. So not show any favoritism to HBO. I would also be really interested in watching Ready Player One with you, as well as a standalone episode, just within the sci-fi genre.
Okay, well, I'll try to find it and see what I can do this weekend.
You can buy it on YouTube for $4.99 to rent.
All right, there you go.
That might, yeah. And there's even like an ultra high definition that's like $9.99. It's like, no thanks, I'll buy it at that point. Yeah. Okay, well, great, Mr. Babcock. This has been great, and we're glad to have you back. And anything that we've left unaddressed, the listeners, just let us know, and we'll be back for more soon.
All right.
Thank
you, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
The podcast you just heard was published with Anchor. Got something you want to say to the creator of this show? Send them a voice message using the Anchor app, free for iOS and Android.